Hello, everyone, and welcome to one of the sessions of the Funding Continuity Day. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to the power of viral misinformation and fake news in COVID-19. As you know, misinformation has played a big role in COVID-19. The spread of news from untrusted news sources has become dangerous to people's lives. To talk about this and much more, we have David Benjamin. David is an American technologist and children's writer. He has had leadership roles in startups, nonprofits, and social enterprises. He is a Master of Science in Engineering in Stanford, and he is the founder and CEO of Wisdom Tech startup. So without any further ado, I will leave the floor to David.
Well, hello, everyone. Really happy to be here talking about this subject. It's something that I've spent a fair amount of time on in the last couple of years. I'm the CEO of a company called Bridget. That's Bridget.io. And Bridget has a mission to connect all the information in the world. And as you can imagine, when you're trying to connect the information in the world, there's many different uses for this type of technology. And one of it is to deal with false claims, fake news, etc. And really connecting the false claims to the fact checks is a very strong use case for the work that I'm doing. We won the Next Generation Internet Award in 2019. That is, Bridget did, and we're super excited to come back and talk about the power of viral information and fake news and COVID-19 and what we can do about it. What is the next generation response? So the agenda today is we'll talk about the COVID-19 infodemic, the fact-checking ecosystem, and just because social media is such a prominent area, we'll look into the area of user-directed corrections, which seems like a very promising approach for dealing with false claims in social media. We'll also talk about the tech innovation response that's happening and an emerging fact-checking tech alliance that I'm part of. The World Health Organization said in March that we're not just fighting a pandemic, we're fighting an infodemic. So what's an infodemic? An infodemic is an overabundance of information. And in this particular case around COVID-19, what we saw in the first couple weeks of the onset of COVID-19, that there was an abundance of literary papers, studies coming out. Many of them were coming out as preprints, meaning that they did not go through the peer review process. In other words, the research community actually adjusted to the fact that we're dealing with something, a pandemic, something that we all need to come together around. So they started creating studies. And my understanding now is that we now have over 9,000 studies about COVID-19. So there's been, you could say, an information or research revolution. The other thing is there's billions of results on Google, billions of pages that speak to the coronavirus or COVID-19. There's so much in the way of information, some of it true, some of it false, that it gets very confusing. Even the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases for the United States, Anthony Fauci, says that it gets confusing. So it's not at all surprising that people, ordinary lay people are having a hard time understanding what's true and what's not, especially with respect to COVID-19. And nowhere is this more apparent than on social media. I'm going to ask you a couple questions about social media, and definitely hoping for a audience response. So, Pablo, I'm not sure how this will work, but the first question is, do you think that false news, fake news is more viral than real news? And if so, what percentage more? Are we able to get responses?
Yeah, just remember that you can chat in the chat section on YouTube, and you can make the questions. We can see them live.
Okay. Are we seeing any answers?
Not for now.
Okay. Well, I'll move on and just mention that there were some studies done a couple years ago on Twitter, and it was found that fake news is 70% more viral than real information. So that's really disturbing in many different ways. Why? How could that be? Well, maybe it's because it's something novel, something that's hard for people to believe, but then because it's published, they feel like it's true. And because it's novel, they then want to push it out. There's probably a number of different reasons, but that's probably one aspect of it. The other thing that I think is really interesting is the number of fake accounts that Facebook took down in 2019. Does anyone have any ideas about how many fake accounts Facebook took down in 2019? Keep in mind, they have about 3 billion users.
I would say 1 million.
Oh, 1 million. Okay. 6 billion. Facebook took down 6 billion accounts in 2019, and they acknowledge that at any given time, there's about 5% fake accounts. So if you take 3 billion people, that's 150 million fake accounts at any given time. Now, why is that? That tells me that there's a lot of money in fake accounts. Why would there be a lot of money in fake accounts? That's because it can change behavior. It gets people to buy things they wouldn't buy, vote for people they wouldn't vote, and take other actions, some of them offline, some of them violent against in situations that they might not otherwise. How do they do this? Well, they make us think that something is more viral than it is. They make us think that there's more interest in this area, and we feel compelled to follow the herd, basically. So this is a big problem, right? In social media, if you have all these fake accounts out there and they're causing people to think certain things are viral and that fake news is more viral than real news. Okay, but it sounds like a perfect storm to me. And why is this important? Well, as Pablo said earlier, we're really talking about lives. And even in the case when information is accurate, people have a hard time dealing with this information overload. It actually promotes anxiety. But when the information is wrong, it can, prevent us from slowing down the spread of the virus. And it also boils down to lost lives. It's just that people may end up taking actions or behaviors, things like thinking that turmeric or garlic or some kind of disinfectant or bleach is going to prevent or cure COVID-19 when, obviously that's not the case. This can lead to the loss of human lives. So it's really important that we get this misinformation problem with COVID-19 handled, and especially in the social media and the social communication applications. So let's talk about the ecosystem. How does this all happen? What are the different elements of this ecosystem? And I've worked with a group of people. We put together this diagram on my Miro, and it really starts at the research level, right? You have information coming out. There's some services that do simplified research. So they translate the research into language that the layperson can understand. So Decipher is an example of one of those. Content producers, they take information, research, or simplified research, and they do something with it. And there's a lot of different types of content producers. Right here, I'm focusing on news media companies, authoritative sources like the CDC and the World Health Organization. And then there's also malicious actors that are content producers. They're actually putting out information that spins something in a way that could potentially cause harm. They're putting out misinformation. There's also poorly informed people. So they may not be malicious in intent, but they're still putting out information that's not correct. Now, in terms of the false claims that we're seeing out there, there's many different ways that they can look, of course, but there's some things that are really kind of just stretches of the truth. They're propaganda, they're biased, they're pushing the exaggeration to the edge and actually venturing into the area of false claims. There's also misinformation. So misinformation is information that's put out there. Maybe it's someone who's poorly informed. Maybe it's outdated or conflicted information. But the intent isn't necessarily there to misinform. It just happens to be the case because the content is not correct. Then there's this other piece, disinformation. This is when a malicious actor is intentionally putting out information for the purpose of manipulating behavior, changing someone's behavior. And this is the realm of fake news, false claims with a malicious intent. So when this happens, a false claim occurs, what's next? Well, there's some possibilities and some systems in place. They're not ubiquitous, of course, but there are some systems that attempt to understand or identify fake news as it comes out, or false claims as it comes out, and act as an early warning system. There is a system that BBC and a number of other large organizations are part of, but it is not ubiquitous. And there's also just this ability on many of the social platforms for users to flag inappropriate content or flag some content as fake news. So those are some of the ways that these information actually gets flags and sometimes turns into alerts, but it isn't. The coverage of it is not optimal, obviously. So how else might this happen? There are fact-checking sites and platforms. There's sites like PolitiFact, and there's over 200 members of the International Fact-Checking Network that's being convened by Pointer. These are standalone sites with people who have journalistic backgrounds reading information and identifying false claims, coming up with fact checks. There's also the emergence recently, and actually not only recently, but over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been the emergence of platforms that enable citizen fact check. So there's News Trust and Dubio and Our News. There's also C-Redder. So there's a lot of different sites that are starting on this path. And in terms of support for the whole fact-checking ecosystem, there's the Internet Archive, which has the Wayback Machine, so you can see the different versions of a web page as it's evolved over time. And that's great because if someone said something and then the website is changed to make it seem like it was never said, we want to make sure that if we're doing fact checks, that we have access to the older information that was previously published. There's also fact-checking training programs, and there's media literacy, misinformation education that's happening in high schools. In terms of correctors, there's professional correctors, and there's also user-directed correctors. But what do they use? Well, they use these fact checks, which come out of the fact-checking system. So these fact checks either live on the sites of the fact checkers, or there are also some online fact check databases, like the coronavirus fact database coming out of the International Fact Checking Network. So here's where the fact checks are. The fact checks are used by either the professional correctors or the user-directed correctors. So the professional correctors are the social media companies, the authoritative sources, and there's also some fact-checking browser extensions. I think I mentioned a couple of them earlier. One is R News, another is CRedder, another one is News Trust. So these browser extensions are attempting to bring the fact check to the false claim, which is definitely a step in the right direction. So that's one aspect of it. But we also have user-directed correctors. So the notion of the user-directed corrector is that they are an independent person who cares about the integrity of the news, or they care about democracy, and they're just taking matters in their own hands. And there's also the emergence of some tools. I'm working on one called Citizen Fact that are wanting to support the user-directed correctors. So when these corrections come out, how do they work? Well, it could be the social media companies. They're putting warnings. They're just putting authoritative links and displaying them next to content in general. And this is it a correction? Not really, but it acts in some ways like a correction. There's also the fact checks and the context overlays that these fact checking browser extensions are creating, and there's native replies. So the user directed correctors, they are replying in Twitter. They're doing a Twitter reply, or they're replying in Facebook to a false claim. So these are how the corrections usually show up on the internet. There's also these some services are coming up now where they're taking the fact checks and they're doing direct messaging either through email or through text message. There's one called You Go Round that I'm familiar with that can get verified information out. And one thing that happens quite a bit when there's a false claim is it ends up going into these private conversations like WhatsApp groups and Telegram, even this new Facebook rooms. This could happen as well. And the problem here with these private conversations is there's no way, especially the ones that are end-to-end encrypted, there's no way for the platform to actually even understand what's happening in the room. So if you wanted anything to happen, someone to do any kind of user-directed correction, it would have to be someone who's part of one of these groups. So what are the issues? We've identified a number of different issues, and I'll be the first to say that this is not extensive. And, I've been watching a little bit what's happening on Global Fact 7, which is a conference happening right now, convened by Pointer and the International Fact Checking Network. And yeah, there's one that I didn't even think of last week, and that was that there's some issues for fact checkers in terms of their safety and whether they have legal protections. So that's another one to add here. But I'll go through the ones that I've identified. So some of the ones that I think are really problematic are, first of all, it takes 13 hours from a false claim to correction, according to the Pointers podcast called Misinformed last year. They also were saying that only a small fraction of the people who see the false claim see the fact check. So these are foundational for me and really problematic. Then there's some other things, like the fact that very few students get this media literacy or misinformation training. There's also the issue that pretty much most of the fact checkers are working on their own databases and not effectively sharing information on fact checking, and none of this information, as far as I know, is accessible via API. So it seems like for the most part, the fact checkers are working in isolation and creating fact checks that live in information silos, their sites. Now, that isn't always the case, and we saw with the coronavirus fact database that organizations did come around for the coronavirus to share a database. But once again, that was not accessible via API. So it used,
David? Yeah, we're having some questions and we're running out of time. There's one of the users who's saying that fact-checking keeps us to speed. How can this fact-checking system be up to speed considering how the information flows right now that we're surrounded by information?
Well, I think it's really important that we create a system where whenever one organization does a fact check, it becomes immediately available to all the other fact checkers. They don't necessarily have to take it and use it. But if the correctors, the people who actually do correctors, had immediate access to the fact checks, then it could help a lot with that problem. I think another thing is we're going to need to have a collaboration between AI and humans to identify false claims as soon as we can. And if we can create early warning systems that then notify the fact checkers, then in fact we have a way to reduce the amount of time and to make sure that all the information is available to all the correctors and fact checkers.
And one last question: how can we protect ourselves from fake news? How can we identify and be more critical on what we read online? What can we do?
Well, I think we have to start with being skeptical about what we read and recognize that we don't really know what's true on the internet right now, and that if something comes up that seems a bit over the top or a bit on the edge of what's believable, we need to do some additional research, and that means doing some searching or taking the specific piece of information to experts within the community, someone that we know has expertise in this particular area, and getting their opinion, and then in fact bringing that back to social media ideally.
This is great. Well, thank you so much. I think it has been a very insightful conversation that we've had. We want to thank you your time. And I know that we missed other questions, but we're running out of time. So thank you, David, and thank you everyone for joining.
All right. Thank you so much.